Hey everyone! I'm with Corinne, straight TikTok, Instagram star, and friend. And I'm Sarah Blessing. And today we are doing Plots and Politics episode 4. Corinne, what is it about? I can't wait.
I am so excited. And I just want everybody to realize that I have finally, episode 4, I have successfully connected my microphone and my headphones. So you can hear me and I can hear Sarah, and there's no feedback because y'all deserve quality, whether you are watching this or you were just listening to this. When I heard the audio quality of last week's episode, I about passed out. So to everyone who listened to it, thank you. You all are true supporters and pioneers because you listen to terrible audio. I'm going to do so much better by you going forward. But today we are jumping into the post-Reconstruction time period. So Reconstruction was right after, 1963 with the Emancipation Proclamation, right through 1877. Post-Reconstruction can really be 1877 all the way to 1965 when the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Acts were passed. But I'm going to focus on the time period of post-Reconstruction that is really 1877 to the early 1900s, like before 1910, because there is so much that happens in that time period that completely undoes the progress that was made during Reconstruction and really sets the stage for the civil rights movement that is to come. And it's dark. I will go ahead and say right up front, there is a whole lot of violence. And it's not like we've not seen violence before, but I did want to highlight some of the instances of violence during this time period because it is a part that people don't want to talk about and they want to shy away from because it is incredibly ugly and horrific and just blatant, unnecessary racist violence. So if that's something that you are not comfortable listening to, I totally understand. It's not something that I feel I could tell this story if I glossed over it.
We don't want to. This is the real story. This isn't the sugar coated, glossed over, slave owners were nice to slaves version of the story. This is what actually happened. And I think that's really refreshing. If you would like to hear part 1, you would check out last week's Plots and Politics episode, which did really well on our YouTube. It's our most famous YouTube show, streaming there by twice as much as our other one.
That's awesome.
So I'm really proud of you, Corinne, for delivering such fantastic content and being so open and honest and vulnerable about what actually happened. How do we actually treat these Black human beings?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just so thankful, and I'm excited to get into this topic. I know that it is painful, but I feel like shining a light on the actual truth is not just pain. It's also, it gives value to what these people experienced and lets them know that we care. They might not be alive anymore, but their ancestors are, and we are all human beings, and we should care about other human beings. And let's see what happened and learn from it, and then let's fix the stuff. Let's fix it now. Yeah. So I'm so proud of you, Corinne, and let's get into it, girl.
Thank you. I'm excited that we're kind of sharing this story. It is, I will say over and over and over again, it is hands down my favorite piece of American history to study. Just because it is so unknown. And we're really going to get into the meat and potatoes of why we don't know this story. The reason we didn't really learn about it in school, all of that groundwork is laid during this post-Reconstruction period. And since we are in Black History Month, y'all, it is February. We're doing this 3-part series because it's Black History Month, but it's American history. And so even though we are spotlighting it as Black history, sometimes Black history is used as by some as a reason to dismiss it as if it is irrelevant. This is American history, y'all. It's American history. And
even that, it's human.
Yes.
All humans are equal.
Yep.
no human being's life is more valuable than another human being's life.
Mhm.
So I just don't understand. I think it comes from hurt. I think it comes from negative places. Um, but every human life matters. So we
100%.
should talk about this dark, dark period in our
Dark,
American
y'all.
history. Yeah.
Ooh. All right, you ready to get into it?
Let's get into it, girl.
Okay, so we left off last week with the Compromise of 1877, which was Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, running against Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat for the presidency. Samuel Tilden won. He won the popular vote, but there were several Southern states that didn't declare victory right away. They didn't declare their electoral votes right away, and there was some backrooms chicanery, and the white Southern Democrats agreed to give the White House to Hayes if he agreed to withdraw Southern troops or to withdraw federal troops from the South, because that was kind of the only thing that was still holding Reconstruction together, was the presence of federal troops in former Confederate states.
And this is where we ended last week.
This is where we ended last week,
Yes.
because that's really the hard
If you
cut.
want more information about what she just said,
Yes.
great episode, Pots and Politics.
Go listen to last week's episode, because that is really the time period that is called Reconstruction. So it's a 12, 14-year time period, 1863, with really a hard cutoff in 1877. The Compromise of 1877, when Hayes was inaugurated as president, it ended Reconstruction. And the Hayes told Southern Democrats, we are removing federal troops, and you all are free to, quote, deal with the blacks without Northern influence. And this is really, really important, that the Southern Democrats, the white Southern Democrats, were perfectly happy to give up the presidency if they got white supremacy in return. That is how important white supremacy and the economic system of slavery was to the South. They gave up the presidency just to get white supremacy back. And that is the first step towards undoing all of this progress going forward.
And this is a human behavior that we have today that we're dealing with. People don't want to give up power, and people don't like change.
Yes.
And so we have that in almost every organization, and you really have to fight it. So just recognizing these people don't want to change. They're scared. They don't want to give up power. They think giving other people power means less power for them, but that is not real. That's not true. And it really hurt these people that have been hurt the most in our country. So it is tragic.
It's super tragic. And it's the South, really watched the federal troops recede, leave the former Confederate states, and Southern states truly felt vindicated. They felt redeemed. They felt like they had won, and their way of life had triumphed. And because Northerners, the Union states, and the White House and Congress, they had all pretty much decided to move on. Collectively, the country pretty much saw Reconstruction as a failure. This was an opinion held all over the country. So this was not solely a Southern belief. They believed that Reconstruction had failed because of all the violence that was happening during Reconstruction, which has always been such a mystery to me, because I'm like, well, the Civil War was violent, and the 300 years or 200 years of slavery that preceded the Civil War was also really violent.
But here's the difference. That violence is quiet. Nobody is writing about and publishing about, at that time. It wasn't widely known what how the slaves were being treated. So they're saying, well, now that we see the violence, we don't want it, and it's worse than it was. And we get that all again with Make America Great Again. It's like, no, it's not like it was great. You just didn't know about it.
You didn't know about it. So you either weren't alive back then, or you've received a very glossed over, you've got some rose-colored glasses with some Vaseline spread on those glasses, so you don't actually see the truth. Like, And that's exactly what it was, because there were more, and this is the time too where mass printing is becoming
Oh,
cheaper to
yeah,
do.
that
It's
makes
becoming
sense.
more accessible. More people are learning how to read. I mean, even white people, middle class, poorer white folks that were not reading, they're learning to read. So you have things happening around this time in the late 1800s that are making these stories much more accessible than they were in the early 1800s. So the stories of horrific treatment of slaves in the early 1800s, those stories didn't make it up to the North.
Yeah.
But these post-Civil War Reconstruction stories, those are making it to the North. And remember that we talked about the passage that was written by a newspaper reporter from New York. He was a former abolitionist, and although he still claimed to be an abolitionist, he was one of the leading voices that said Reconstruction was a failure. And he wrote a piece called The Lost Cause, where he was arguing Reconstruction and abandoning slavery is a lost cause. We should stop. And that lost cause phrase, written by a New Yorker, was taken by Southern Democrats as kind of their mantra, kind of their rallying cry. It was a lost cause. We should pretty much give up. So this time period after Hayes is elected, federal troops are gone, you really see the 1880s and 1890s as kind of this weird in-between time. So there are still some rights, like there are still some Black folks who are voting. That had not been completely taken away yet. There are still some Black people who are owning property and running farms and owning homes and running businesses. None of that had been totally taken away yet, but the Jim Crow laws were in place. And for those of you who don't know, Jim Crow was a character. He was a minstrel character, and minstrel is the form of, I can't even call it art, it's disgusting, but it's the form of performance where a white person puts on blackface and they do a performance as a Black person. So this was a white dude named Tom, and he created a character called Jim Crow where he played a Black slave. And so that is how these laws were named. So these Jim Crow laws started being introduced in state legislatures in the 1860s, and they would stand for 100 years until the 1960s when the Civil Rights Act was passed. So a really strong set of laws. And so the 1880s and 90s, these laws were not fully implemented yet. They were kind of spotty. And so you kind of see this weird Eric Foner, who is a historian that's done so much writing on Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, he calls this like the Twilight Zone, like time period. It's just a weird time period where not everything is settled. So the dust is kind of still settling.
And there aren't, because of the president that got elected and because they took down the protections in the South for slaves, it's not like these former slaves are just free and doing great. A lot of them are just in complete oppression, and there's no governing body protecting them, right?
Not so. They're in 1875, and I didn't cover this in the last episode because it's more relevant to this time period. So in 1875, so right before Hayes took office, Congress actually passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And this preserved the rights for Black people to enjoy free movement in theaters, hotels, restaurants, trains, public transit. So there was a Civil Rights Act that was in place in 1875. Unfortunately, the courts were not going to be the agency that would uphold this civil rights legislation. So there was kind of a false sense of protection that some Black people had during this time period because of the Civil Rights Act, because they fought to get that passed in Congress, and it passed. Before the troops were pulled out of the South, it passed. One of the first challenges to this law was challenged by a woman named Ida B. Wells. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because she goes on to become, and we will talk about her again a little later in the story, but she goes on to become one of the most influential journalists I would argue, in American history, one of the most influential journalists in our history. But this is kind of her first foray into civil rights, into the public sphere. She was a teacher, and she got on a train like normal. It wasn't a protest or a staged thing of any kind. She just got on a train and she went to sit in the ladies' car. Because she was a Black woman, she was told by the conductor she had to leave and go sit in the Black train car. She couldn't sit in the ladies' car. She refused to move. She said, I have the Civil Rights Act of 1875. I have the right to be in this car. He started physically trying to pull her off of the train. She bit him in the hand. She bit down hard on his hand. Eventually, a bunch of other employees from the railroad had to come and physically remove her from the train. She sued the railroad company for violating the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and she won in lower court. The railroad company appealed and to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned the ruling. So that was one of the first court blows to the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And we will just see the courts pull this legislation apart piece by piece by piece to where it's completely void. So that was
so
kind
frustrating.
Of the first test.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating. The courts just tear it down. This great law. And
W.E.B. Du Bois, who also goes on to become an incredibly influential writer. He was one of the founding members of the NAACP. One of his famous quotes, I think, is super pertinent to this kind of story, to what happened to Ida B. Wells. And he said, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery." And so Ida B. Wells was born into slavery. She had become free. She had educated herself. She had become a teacher. She was having her moment in the sun. She goes and sits on the train just like she does all the time. And all that she had done for a long time. It's a normal day, going to sit on a train. All of a sudden, she is physically removed from that and placed back into an area of slavery. And so it's a very sad picture. Like, I literally picture Ida stepping onto the train into the sunlight and then being pulled out into the darkness. And that will definitely shape who she becomes for the rest of her life. So we will get back to her in a little bit. But you mentioned kind of the system of oppression that was already in place in the South, even during Reconstruction, because we remember as soon as Civil War ended, as soon as the slaves were freed, Frederick Douglass said, okay, what form is slavery going to take now? Because it was the economic system. We have to remember that is why the South never wanted to give up slavery, because they had no other way to work their farms. They had never figured out a way to have employees they have to pay. Just think of that, never had to pay employees ever. And so now all of a sudden they're faced with having to pay employees, and they're like, hell no, we better figure out a way to do this where we don't have to pay, but we don't actually call it slavery. So this is the re-evolution of what Frederick Douglass said was going to happen. What form is slavery going to take now? Slavery by another name comes into place in the South. And Blacks in the South obviously still needed a job. Whites in the South had all of their land returned to them, remember, by President Andrew Johnson. And so they still owned all the land, and they needed the land worked. So what they decided to do is they leased 50-acre or so plots of land to Black families and Black farmers and said, you work the land, you live on the land, and you give us a portion of the crops that you grow as rent. So a share of your crops. So these people are sharecroppers. So this is where sharecropping becomes kind of the norm.
Right.
And on the surface, that sounds like, okay, well, they have land, they're getting food, they're able to sell their crops to make a living.
Yeah, okay. It sounds good. It sounds
okay.
great.
You can't own the land. Oh, okay.
Right.
What happens is the white owners start to charge interest and rent on everything that the Black people are using, because the Black farmers are not able to own any of the equipment. So all of the equipment, the animals, the seeds, the house that they live in on the land, all of these are kind of being taxed on with interest. So all of these Black farmers are very, very quickly falling into huge debts with the white farmers. At the same time, the sharecroppers were doing part of the work. But this, we have to remember, all of the South, it's all farmland. It's all agriculture. There are millions and millions of laborers needed. And so in addition to sharecropping, they look for another labor pool. And this is where discussing the 13th Amendment and how it was kind of written to have a loophole is very important. And I do want to point y'all to a documentary on Netflix called The 13th. And it's by Ava DuVernay. It is a brilliant documentary. It should make you incredibly angry when you watch it, but I think it's crucial. So if you do want a good documentary to watch, it's called The 13th, because the 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolished slavery. But it was written, slavery is abolished except as a punishment for a crime.
Oh no, I did not know that.
Yep. So it
And then you can like
absolutely
accuse the people of just about anything and get away with it.
anything. So we have to look, y'all, our current system of incarceration, our current system of prisoners for profit, getting people into the correctional facilities to get them to work for you for $1 a day, that system started in the 1880s.
So that loophole is still happening now. I mean, I think people know about this, but not everybody knows about it. But yeah, we have these for-profit prisons. We have these people in the South that are mostly Black in the prisons that are picking cotton for, what is it, $1 an hour, $1 a day?
They don't get anything. They get nothing.
And it's slavery in prisons.
Yep.
And
Just
this
by
is
another
why.
name.
So we have this and we haven't fixed it. And that's why this is happening now.
Still, this is still, the 13th
Yeah.
Amendment is still why you do laundry for your prison when you are serving time. We work in the laundry room. You work in the kitchen. You work as a janitor. You work as a gardener. You work for your prison and don't get paid for it because of the 13th Amendment. So what happened in the 1880s is still happening in the 2020s. Our prisons are still profiting off of prisoners. And so anytime somebody wants to tell you, oh, it's just Black history, oh, it's just the Civil War, or it's hell no, this is American history, and this is why it is so crucial that we have an understanding of how we got here today. And there have been some court challenges that have come up because prisoners will be, we saw this happen during the California wildfires. Low risk inmates were taken to go fight California wildfires. I think they were paid $17 a day for their time. This is still happening. This is
I listened to an interview on The Daily Show from, I don't know, last week or 2 weeks ago, where they had a man that was becoming a firefighter now. He had just gotten out of prison and he was being a firefighter and helping. And so he was explaining the training they got and what actually happened with it. And it was pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So we all need to know about this, that this is going on.
And this is for-profit prisons. All of this. This is capitalism. We will exploit labor any way we can.
So true.
And so in addition to sharecropping, Southern farmers were able to do something called convict leasing, where Black men were literally arrested for standing on a street corner because that was vagrancy. They chewed gum in public. That was indecent to chew gum in public. They looked at a white woman. That was assault. So all of these trumped up, ridiculous charges.
How can you even live? If you're a Black man, how do you even live? You would want to just, how do you provide for your family? No matter what you do, you're going to get accused of a crime and then put into slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You can. And this is, really where we start to see some of the, especially in the South, and we'll get to a little bit more of this in just a second, but especially in the South, Black people said, okay, we're just going to make our own communities.
Right.
We're going
To
to
be
make our
someplace
own
safe.
everything because we don't want to, if we
Yeah.
mingle with the white folks, we literally get arrested. So,
Yes. Stay away from the white people. Yes.
Yep.
That makes sense.
So Ida B. Wells, when her violation, her civil rights were violated when she was removed from that train, but she lost her court case because the Tennessee Supreme Court said, you're Black, so we don't care. That was the first dismantling of the Civil Rights Act. The full dismantling of the Civil Rights Act happened in the Supreme Court in 1883. And I love this little tidbit because it really reframes the focus of the entire country. So this was a couple in San Francisco, a Black couple in San Francisco who went to the opera, purchased first class tickets, so to sit kind of in like the first class apron section at the opera, and they were not allowed to sit there, which was a clear violation of the Civil Rights Act because it included theaters and public spaces and entertainment spaces. And it like, this is not Montgomery, this is not Nashville, this is not Charlottesville, this is San Francisco, California, that we can now see as kind of a pretty liberal place. I mean, think of how we think of California now. It's Silicon Valley, it's a bunch of tech people, it's a bunch of hippies. San Francisco is the reason that this Civil Rights Act was overturned. And this language, you're going to love this, Sarah, because it could have been written in 2025, y'all. The Supreme Court struck down, completely voided the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And they said, when you leave slavery, you have to gain progress. You have to work for it. It can't just be given to you by Congress. You no longer get to remain the favorite of the law. This is written towards Black people. When anti-discrimination laws are put into place, the United States is violating the rights of its citizens by giving preferential treatment to Black Americans.
So we talked about this last week, but I'm going to bring it up again here. It has to be the cultural horrors from that time period where they viewed Black people as less than human. It just seems to be still going on. This couple couldn't just sit down and watch the opera. That was an assault to the other people. And in that view of being disgusted being around people, it makes me want to throw up. But we have to acknowledge it. This is happening. If they had been viewed as human beings, just like them, no better or worse, I don't think these things would have happened. I think that they would have been allowed to sit in the train car or sit in the opera house.
Absolutely.
And we need to just acknowledge that this was the cultural norm. Like you're saying with the Jim Crow thing, with the entertainment, being as it was propaganda for how these people are less than. Yeah. And it's disgusting.
And when we hear the state of Indiana, the state legislature, talking and discussing anti-DEI legislation, the Indiana legislature is trying to make it illegal to consider race or ethnicity in any kind of academic admission or scholarship. So any kind of scholarship that is given because you are the first Hispanic member of your family to go to college, because a college wants to represent the population, so it wants to give additional incentives to Black students. The state of Indiana wants to make that illegal because they view it as discrimination against white people. They view it as preferential treatment to people of color. And so to read a Supreme Court decision from 1883 and to read 2025 Indiana state lawmakers on the floor of the House in Indianapolis today arguing the same thing, this is why we have to learn this stuff. This is why we have to understand.
We just keep repeating. We just keep repeating the same mistakes of human behavior. We just have more technology, like you say.
Equality is not a threat to you. It's not a threat. And that is how it is being presented.
And it's so
And
easy because when you spark the fear,
yep,
your
the fear,
your fear things
that's
in your brain
all.
take over, and you're like, protect my children,
Yep.
protect, and it's like, no, 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 nobody is hurting your white kids
Hmm.
in trying to help other people that are struggling more than us.
Hmm.
Um, it's really hard. I have friends that do not agree with me on this issue. And it's really hard to explain it to them without getting their feelings them wound up.
Yeah.
And if they just listen to this episode, maybe it would help. But if you have friends and you're listening to this, I encourage you to go ahead and talk about the subject and just yourself don't get emotional and
Hmm.
just keep trying to explain it because eventually it's going to get through to some people. We should care about everybody equally. And
And we
and
had, and anyone who wants to say the Civil War is a thing of the past, it doesn't matter anymore. Um, this is why it's still relevant. And I always want to, I remind people, so this is going back to the 1880s. What is that? My great great grandparents. So my great great grandparents were owning property, attending universities, starting businesses, building wealth,
right, that they could pass
starting
on to their
exactly.
families.
And this is why we still see that Black families own a fraction of the wealth that white families had. So this is not ancient history. This is 100% relevant history because Black Americans have been deprived. They had their moment in the sun. They had 12 years of starting to dismantle the system of slavery that had existed for centuries. They only got 12 years to try to fix it. That's not enough time, right? And so this is where we see this wealth gap, current wealth gap started here. And because we've never reconciled it, because we're too afraid to talk about it, it still persists. And when
And
I
this
was,
doesn't just affect Black people. This affects people that are poor, that are born into poverty. This
mhm,
affects all of those people. And in my community, there are a lot of people suffering, and they're white people. So
mhm,
if we worked on helping everybody that's in poverty bring them up, we would help the people that need it the most. And so when we go after people that look different than us, we are also attacking the same people that look the same as us, but they don't have generational wealth.
100%, 100%. Um, so I touched on this just a minute ago, but there's also this time period in the 1880s and 90s where Black Southerners are divided kind of into two groups, those who left and those who stayed. After Hayes got into office and the Civil Rights Act was overturned, many Black Southerners kind of saw the writing on the wall. They said, look, this is not only are we not going to be prosperous here, it's not safe for us anymore here because Black Southerners were being killed all the time for any reason, and there was no federal intervention to protect them. So one of the first big migrations that happened out of the South was actually going to Kansas. The state of Kansas was kind of advertising, hey, come here, because Kansas had a lot of land to farm too. And so while the Southerners that left found better treatment in Kansas, they were still under Jim Crow laws, so it wasn't perfect.
But at least it's better. Yeah.
It was a little bit better. The Black Southerners who decided to stay kind of had the attitude of, well, this is the evil that I know. I know this life here. I might as well try to make it work. And so they self-segregated themselves. They created their own communities. They bought their own homes. They started their own businesses, their own schools, their own churches. And they said, we're just going to be self-sufficient by ourselves.
And you would think white people would like that because clearly they're not wanting Black people to sit in them, in their train cars or their operas. Not every white person. I'm sure there's a bunch of white people that are accepting.
Mm-hmm.
But you would think they'd want this
You
because
would
then
think.
they're in their segregated community, taking care of themselves, not causing any burden to white people.
And in our next episode, we will get into some of the dismantling of these communities because many of these communities that were built in the 1880s survived through the 1920s. And it was fine until white people recognized that Black people were doing well economically. And that is where the white rage comes in.
And that's when you start blaming.
Yes.
If you're not doing well economically and you see the town next to you is all Black and they're doing well, you think you're not doing well because they are. And that's not the way it works.
Nope.
And we have that problem today. So it's really easy to blame your own problems on an otherness. Immigrants, people that are different religions, different country, whatever. And that's just not the truth. But the truth is complicated, and that lie is simple.
And that, I mean, so like you touched on immigrants, right? It's their fault
that
Don't
you're
look
having
at
a
me.
hard time.
Yeah, and it's usually an incredibly wealthy person in power that is telling you, hey, poor white person, blame the immigrant, blame the women that should be staying home and taking care of your kids, blame the Black high school student that just got a scholarship because of a diversity quota, blame them. Don't look at me that I don't really pay taxes.
And whose fault is it? It's the people in power.
Absolutely. And they're the ones telling
and they're
you
white, and they want to stay in power, and they want to stay in control. And so they want us fighting, and they want us talking about other simple fears. They don't want us coming together and uniting and saying, no, you person in power, you're the problem.
Yep. Exactly. Because if they keep us distracted, fighting, squabbling down here for all of the crumbs that we get, then we don't pay attention to, I mean, what did I just see? Tesla, the company of Tesla, paid no taxes in 2023. How are we not? Right? How are we not mad about that? The state of Indiana right now is
that can barely stay housed. And they're paying more taxes.
100%.
It makes me so angry. And I'm not going to be angry at the people suffering. I'm angry at the people in power making those decisions.
And I'm not going to be angry at the Venezuelan immigrant who came here and their kid gets a scholarship to go to college because there's a first generation kid. That's not my enemy.
No.
That's not my enemy. And that, again, we're the same animals. We're the same damn Americans we were in the 1880s that we are right now, because white fear works. It works. It is politically and economically successful propaganda.
It's so simple. It's so easy to spark fear. And it's so hard to correct, because once you're scared, your brain goes into emergency mode, and it's harder for you to calm down and focus and rationalize. So keeping us in that state of fear, anxiety, and panic makes it much easier for these people in power to manipulate us.
Yep.
So that is happening now. I'm just going to plug, I'm going to do an episode on Sunday at 12 with Scott Aaron Rogers about this topic. We're going to be talking about manipulation and how they are able to do it. But you've touched on it today so wonderfully, Corinne. This is a method used in the 1800s, and it is used now. In a more powerful way because of our technology and our way to get a message out. So tune into that on Sunday. We'll continue this talk.
Because propaganda is powerful, y'all. I mean, that's why it's used all over the world. It's used as a control tactic because it's effective. And we'll get into some more propaganda here in a minute.
Oh, I want to hear some more. Okay.
Coming based on white fear. So what you just touched on a minute ago, Sarah, it's like we're of the same brain here, because Black farmers and poor white farm workers started to realize, hey, y'all, we got more in common together than any of us have with those wealthy white landowners.
Yeah.
And so there was a farmers alliance that started building. And it was despite this horrific time period, there are some pretty lovely pieces of sunlight. And this is one of them. This common struggle shared between poor white land workers and Black farmers, they formed an alliance. They started pooling resources. They would buy equipment and share it. They would buy seeds and share it. They would share labor. Somebody's growing corn, you're growing corn, I'm growing beans, we're sharing. And so there was this beautiful alliance happening of really self-reliant, self-sustaining communities. And they started understanding, all right, we've got some economic power now. Now we need political power. Both the Republicans, even if they were abolitionists, even if they were anti-slavery, they do not give a crap about the future success of Black Americans or poor white Americans. They're not the party of us. And Democrats are the party of slavery. So we can't side with them. We got to make our own party. This is the creation of the populist movement. There was a populist party. It's actually, to date, the single most successful third party challenge to the US two-party system. And they were pulling Republicans and Democrats to their cause. So they were diluting the power of both Republicans and Democrats to come down to to the populist party. This pissed off both parties. So both the Democrats and the Republicans were very angry about this. They started launching a lot of propaganda, and they started infiltrating these alliance groups with their plants, with people that shared their propaganda message. They started sharing a lot of disinformation. It was deliberate lies about Black farmers. They're stealing from you. They're hurting your kids. They're coming after your women.
It would be so easy to do that, to spread the fear.
And so the populist party, it started to dissolve around this time. So we're kind of working up to the 1890s here. Remember how many state legislatures had Black elected officials through the 1870s and 1880s. Well, as those terms started coming up, Southern states got together and started holding constitutional conventions, because the 15th Amendment had said race cannot be a barrier to slavery. And the Southern states now, with the absence of federal troops, really wanted to get rid of that Black vote altogether.
Oh, yeah.
And they had to figure out how to do it without saying race. So they held constitutional conventions led by Mississippi. Mississippi is usually on the front lines of horrible stuff. They were the first state to do it. They held a constitutional convention in the early 1890s. And this is where they established a huge, powerful set of those Jim Crow laws that would stay until the 1960s, where they instituted literacy tests, poll taxes, and even constitutional comprehension tests. So they would force a voter to come in and take a comprehension test on how well you understand your state's constitution before you could vote. So this suppressed the Black vote. It went from about 60-70% of Black folks voting to less than 5% in the period of just a couple of years. So it not only suppressed the Black vote, it also suppressed the poor white vote. So that alliance that had been formed between poor white farmers and poor Black farmers, both of them were being politically disenfranchised because those folks were largely not literate. So the white elites of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, got what they wanted. They suppressed the vote of these poor people who were starting to get some power with the populist movement.
I just want to make sure everybody realizes the poor people that were starting to work together. There is so many more of them than the ones in power.
Mm-hmm.
There are fewer rich people running the show than there are people struggling. So the rich people in power always know that today and back then. They got to keep us divided. They got to keep you fighting, because if you worked together, you would overpower them. You would vote them out.
Yeah.
Even with the bad voting things they had back then, you had more of them.
Exactly. And they knew that.
And then also the lack of education. This is something that is happening today with back then, so poor people, regardless of their race, weren't as highly educated as the ones with money.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing that now. They're trying to dismantle in Indiana public education so that just the wealthy parents, the kids, can get a proper education, and everybody else's education's been dismantled so bad, you're not going to get as good of an education.
Yep.
So it's the same systems over and over to keep these wealthy white people in power.
Yep.
Same things.
Yep. The 99% of us have much more in common with each other than we do with the 1%.
And the whole point of Project Next is to unite us. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter who you voted for. Let's work together to change the systems so that we can actually help us.
And help our neighbors.
Because
Yep.
right now, it doesn't matter who you voted for. The people in power are trying to hurt us.
All of us.
All of us. It doesn't matter who you vote. It's not like they single out and they just hurt the people that didn't vote for them. They're hurting the people that voted for them.
Yeah.
So,
and some of those people are still happy about it for some reason, but we're going to let that go for a little bit.
That's the thing you're talking about.
That's the propaganda.
The disinformation. It's a calculated, planned strategy happening in the 1800s, happening right now, to keep the people thinking that they don't have it made because of other people.
Yep.
Not because of the people in power. Same things.
Don't look at the money at the top, right? Look at all you down at the bottom.
It's so great that you explain what happened back then, but it's so mind-blowing to me how the exact same thing is happening now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Keep going, Corinne. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're good. This is the fun part, right? Is that we get to talk about it, and we get to say, wait, when was that written? 1885 or 2025? Because that sounds awfully familiar, right?
Sounds the same. Yeah.
Gosh. And so this system of disenfranchisement for Black voters, this led into the propaganda, because then the white folks got to turn around and say, look, we told you they were inferior. They can't even pass the literacy test. This is written in newspaper. They can't even pass the literacy test. They don't understand our constitution, our state constitution. They can't pass the comprehension test. They shouldn't be allowed to vote. We told you they were inferior. And this leads and gives more credence to an academic racism. There is a scientific racism now that starts happening in our most prominent universities. Our Ivy League universities start studying the concept of scientific racism. And it allows racists, all of these high and mighty white supremacists who think they are so educated, feel really, really good about their white supremacy because they believe there is science to back it up. It is all bunk. It is all pseudoscience. None of it has any legitimacy. It is all based on like skull shape and skull size. And it's bunk
so gross. It reminds me of like Nazi Germany stuff.
It is. It's eugenics. It's eugenics. It's just not called eugenics yet. And it is looking at people to find, okay, well, why can't these Black folks, why can't they pass a literacy test?
And is it like because their noses are bigger or something?
It's like it's skull shaped. It's so weird. It's so weird, the stuff that they do, that they talk about. It's disgusting. And it's like, we're not going to talk about the fact that we've never given them an education. We've never allowed them to learn how to read. We've never allowed them to have any of these privileges that white people have. We're not going to focus on that when we see they can't pass a literacy test.
It's because
it's because of their skull.
They look different than us.
Like, look how desperate these white people are to just feel superior, right? Like, this is a desperation. And this became an important tool. I mean, we'll see this go well through the well into the 19th century, late 20th century. We will see this continue to be perpetuated. This is still used as an explanation for why Black men are incarcerated at such a higher rate than white men. It's not called these same things anymore, because again, we are still incredibly racist. We're just trickier about how we talk about it.
Oh yeah.
And so it's inclination to violence. More likely, again, we're ignoring socioeconomic factors, education levels, poverty levels. We're ignoring all of that contributes to violence or substance abuse. And we're just going to say it's a race issue. So this scientific racism was really, really important to kind of cement white supremacy and cement these people feeling like they were correct. These Black communities that were set up in the South, they were completely self-sufficient. They had their own dry cleaners, they had their own launderers, they had their own groceries, they had their own banks, their own schools, their own churches. For most of them, there was never any reason to leave the confines of their community, and most of them never did. But there were these white mobs that would police. They were the color line police, and they were just self-created mobs. And they would literally go around and police the border of the town. And if they believed that somebody stepped out into the white part of town, they just drug them into the woods and killed them. And this is where we're going to get into some of the grosser pieces of this and the harder to hear pieces. But again,
it happened. It deserves to get a light shine on it. There's people that this happened to. It deserves that we talk about them.
Their memories. Yeah, their memories deserve us to honor them. And so this is the practice of lynching. And I used to be when I was younger, I was really confused by the definition of lynching. I always thought lynching was hanging. And lynching just means extrajudicial law, extrajudicial killings. So killings happening outside of the courts. So really, vigilante
it's not a particular method. They're just getting killed outside of the courts. People are taking over and deciding they're going to do justice themselves and kill these
vigilante
people.
Justice. Exactly. Right. Yes.
Okay. So I don't think I knew that either. So thanks for clarifying.
And hanging was a popular form of lynching because then the person was suspended, usually from a tree, usually right outside of where the color line was, as a symbol to the other Black people in that neighborhood. This is what happens when you cross that line. This is what happens when you come.
So as a warning, you stay out.
Yes. So hangings were a popular form of lynching. But lynching just means, vigilantes killing people without the courts doing anything or convicting anyone. So there was an interesting little case that happened, which really kind of was the spark that made lynching become more of a national conversation. And this is where Ida B. Wells comes back in again. So after she loses her court case, she actually decides, oh, this is what I need to do with my life. And she becomes a journalist, and she actually becomes part owner of a newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee.
Wow.
And in Memphis, Tennessee, in a neighborhood, there are two little boys playing together, a Black boy and a white boy. They're playing marbles on the sidewalk.
Oh, no.
Completely innocent. The Black boy wins the game of marbles.
Oh, no.
Uh-huh. And for some reason, the white kid's dad is really pissed about this game of marbles. Like, what is the Black kid supposed to, are you supposed to purposely lose marbles? Maybe your kid just sucks at marbles, white dad. Have a conversation with your kid and make him better at marbles. Anyway,
or not get upset at losing. It's not be a sore loser. It's marbles. It's a kid's game. Yeah.
Right? So this blows up into a fight between the parents, the Black dad and the white dad. The fight eventually ends up inside the Black grocery store in that part of town in Memphis. The police are called. They end up arresting the 3 Black male grocery store owners. So not the white dad that's pissed off about marbles, the grocers who are just doing their job while these dads come in and are fighting. The grocers have nothing to do with this at all. These 3 grocers are arrested. They are taken to jail. In the middle of the night, a white mob gets together. They go into the jail. Of course, they are led into the jail by the jailer. They remove these 3 Black men. They take them to an abandoned rail yard and they kill them. They shoot them in the head. One of these grocery store owners is a family friend of Ida B. Wells, and she actually knew him and his wife. She was the godmother to their children. And when she finds out that this happened, she's like, oh, I got to write about this. So not only does she investigate the lynching of her friend and these other 2 men, she does an investigation on lynching as a whole. And what she finds, and these also will sound very familiar to us, what she finds is that most lynchings start with a rape accusation. And that rape accusation is either to cover up a consensual relationship between a white woman and a Black man, because that was happening. There were consensual relationships. And when those relationships would be discovered, the white woman would have to accuse of rape, or her family would have to accuse the black man of rape to like preserve
Save
her
their
her
integrity
reputation or whatever.
Yeah, gross.
So gross. So it was either to cover up a consensual relationship, or it was recognizing there was a black man, like a grocer or somebody else, who was just doing too well in town. They were doing too well financially, and this is how we're going to take them down a peg. So they would just randomly accuse them of rape. So that's where like 98% of lynchings came from, was an accusation of rape. So she started digging in, and she published a huge investigative piece on lynchings in the newspaper that she owned. Eventually, this cost her her job and her home, and she was driven out of Memphis because she published this story. And one of my favorite quotes from her is, because she was getting so many threats after this, but don't you worry, this woman is not deterred. The fighting spirit in this woman
sounds just incredible.
She's a badass.
Yeah.
She got a handgun to carry in her pocketbook, and she said, "Oh, I know I'm not going to survive, but I'm definitely going to shoot me some lynchers before they get me." And like, she was like, "Oh, I know they'll kill me, but I'll make sure I shoot a couple of them first." And so that was her attitude. She was fearless. She carried a gun around in her handbag then. So she's driven from Memphis. She and Frederick Douglass get together and head up to Chicago for the World's Fair in 1893.
Oh, wow.
And the World's Fair in Chicago, this is America, the United States, 130-ish years, 120-ish years after becoming a country. This Chicago World's Fair was supposed to be the United States' opportunity to showcase, look how well we're doing, Europe. We're killing it. We're modernized. We've surpassed all of you. We're making this beautiful new country. Everybody come look. And really, a whole bunch of people in the world came over 6 months, which is kind of crazy to me to think of like a 6-month fair.
But it makes sense because it takes so long to get
there. It takes so long to get there, right? Like, you got to start traveling 6 months in advance to get there. But like, over 6 months, over 25 million people came to Chicago from around the world. But Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass went to the World's Fair, and they were like, this is a pretty white fair you got going here. There was no mention of Black people. There was no representation of Black people. There were no booths, businesses, performers. Black people were completely erased from the World's Fair. And the World's Fair was actually said, they started calling it the White City, not only because there were no Black people featured, but all of the lights. There were so many lights that it was bright and it shone like it was white. So it was kind of called White City for two different reasons. And Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass decided to start printing pamphlets and handing it out to everybody at the fair. They wanted the people in the world to understand that this image of the United States that Chicago is trying to show you, it's nonsense. I'm going to show you what's really happening here.
They just seem so smart. It seems like the best place to be to get the word out about what's going on in America, what's really happening.
And so her investigative piece where she talks about lynchings is in there. Douglass and Wells and a whole bunch of other writers contribute stories of all of the progress that the Black people had made during Reconstruction. They highlight all of this progress, and they churn up such a frenzy with these pamphlets that the World's Fair says, okay, we'll give you a day. Out of 6 months, we're going to give you 1 day. And they call it, this is their word, not mine, they called it Negro Day. Frederick Douglass was given a platform to speak. And even, 25 million people came over 6 months. So there weren't that many people listening to him speak, of course, but there were lots of people there. And this is one of his most famous speeches. And it ends up being one of his last speeches because he dies about a year after this and kind of falls into poor health. But this resonated with so many people of the world, especially the people of Europe who were at least 100, if not 200 years beyond slavery in Europe from where the United States was. We were just less than 30 years away from slavery. So the people of Europe really saw kind of the disconnect that was happening here. The United States is attempting to present to us that they are modern and civilized, and yet this is how they're treating Black people. And Frederick Douglass said, this is just a little excerpt from his speech. He said, Black Americans, we love this country and we actually fought to save this country. And the only thing we are asking is to be treated as well as those who fought to destroy this country. And it was such a stark juxtaposition. And it was it was counteracting the message that was out there, because Europe is receiving news communications from New York newspapers and Chicago newspapers. They are receiving news about the United States that is only being written by white people. And they're not hearing about all of the slaves that went and fought for the Union. They're not hearing about all of the progress that had been made during Reconstruction. And so the reputation of the United States does get a little sullied during this time, because people of the world, Chicago's attempting to show the world, look how great we're doing. And Frederick Douglass is saying, you're treating the Confederacy that tried to take down the United States better than you're treating us, and we tried to save it. So there is a bit of an international spotlight that will start to help the United States. It's just going to take a couple of decades to help us and to help Black Americans. But this is kind of like the seed that was planted. So we're going to go back to the courts for a minute. Even though Ida B. Wells did not purposefully go sit on that train to like make a point, there is a dude who actually did that. He wanted to test the segregation laws. And this is ends up being a very well-known Supreme Court case, and we will know this one. His name was Homer Plessy, and he decided to go sit on a bus because he wanted to test the segregation law. And it ended up working its way up to the Supreme Court to become Plessy v. Ferguson, which most of us have probably heard of. And this is where the Supreme Court said separate but equal. So this was an 1896 court decision that said, if Black people have their own buses, their own schools, their own train, what's the problem? It's separate but equal. Now, eventually we know that would be overturned in the 1950s by Brown v. Board of Education, because at that point, the Supreme Court said, it cannot be equal if it is separate. Like those are that's counterintuitive. So 1896 Supreme Court kind of sets this precedent that would last for nearly 60 years. In the 1890s, and this is kind of where we're going to see some of this history piece and come back and us have a much better understanding of why we view this time period the way that we view it. And the author George Orwell said, he who controls the past controls the future. And I love that quote, because I think of that all the time when I have these kind of conversations is, history is written by the victors, and whoever's going to write that history and whoever controls it is going to control how we view it in the future. And the lost cause rhetoric had been adopted by the South, and particularly by the women of the South. And this is where the women of the South really start to piss me off. They form an organization called the Daughters of the Confederacy. And these Southern women were of a generation who had grown up in prominent slave-owning families. So they're 15, 16, 17 years old when slavery falls. And they're pissed about it because they don't understand why this beautiful Southern lifestyle they were promised had been taken away from them. And so they're now women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who were like, this life was stolen from me. I was promised this beautiful Southern slave-owning life. So the Daughters of the Confederacy arguably become one of the most influential political organizations in this country. And we are still dealing with the ramifications of their influence today. They took control of the memory of the Civil War. They carried on Robert E. Lee's legacy of kind of rewriting the narrative that he spent the last couple years of his life doing. They carried on that legacy, and their form of rewriting this history was in monuments, it was in pop culture, and it was in textbooks. All of the monuments, the Civil War monuments that decorate the South, some of them have come down now, but all of them that decorate the South were put up by Daughters of the Confederacy.
Wow.
They led the charge around the South.
It sounds
They
so sweet. Daughters.
right?
I mean, that name is very
Little Southern Belles,
misleading.
right? Oh no, they're evil. They are evil. And they are, again, something has been taken from them. They believe their status as white women, white
Right.
Southern women, had been taken from them. And they're going to get it back by completely changing what the Civil War was actually about. And you have to think of how easy this was to do back then without the internet, without phones, right? You just kind of say, well, hell, people still do it now, but you just kind of say something and nobody really has the
There's
tools
no proof. It
wrong.
was harder to prove whether that was right or not.
Yep.
But
So
I mean, this is so what's happening now. We're trying to rewrite history, blame people that it's not their fault, make sure that we know the people in power with the money and the control that it's not their fault. It's
no,
these people that are other something.
of
It's
course.
their fault. So same thing happening. And I would say it's harder now because it's so easy to quickly pump that message out
Mm-hmm.
and to get everybody else to pump the message out. And it's so hard to get the truth out
Yep.
because the truth is confusing and not black and white and takes some time to listen. And if you're in that panic mode, if you're in that fear place, you mentally don't have the ability to listen and learn.
And it's
So
usually, yeah, and usually the propaganda is so cut and dry. It is so black and white. It's good and evil. And when the real story is much more nuanced and people are like, I don't have time to learn all that. So these women, so not only did they erect all of these monuments around the South, they were also responsible for all of the textbooks. And not just in the South, but in the North as well. Not all of the North, but some of the North, because some of the textbook publishers are distributing their textbooks in the South and in the North. These women had veto power over anything that was in these textbooks. Anything that mentioned slaves being treated poorly, slave owners as bad, anything that mentioned violence against Black people, anything that mentioned that the Civil War was fought over slavery. This is where states' rights becomes the talking point. The Civil War was not about slavery, it was about states' rights. And anytime somebody says that, you have to be like, okay, but the states' rights to do what? The right of the state to own slaves. There you go. It's slavery. But they had, so all of these textbooks were in American classrooms, white American classrooms, beginning in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And all of those children that are learning this new history, all of these kids who were not alive during the Civil War, all of these children are the segregationists and the white supremacists of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s in America. That's who these kids grow up to be. We see this today. This information is stripped out of our kids' textbooks today. Anything that mentions white supremacy, the presence of the KKK, leaders from the KKK who are elected to prominent positions, slavery being bad. This is where the happy slave comes in, because to go along with these textbooks, the Daughters of the Confederacy are commissioning art pieces to show nostalgic.
terrible.
There's so many layers. They are commissioning artists to paint and then mass produce lithograph prints of these paintings that show this beautiful South with happy slaves working in a field and beautiful white women in their big dresses sitting on a porch, and everybody is just happy. Like, even in the picture, you can see the Black woman is out slaving in a field and the white woman is on the porch drinking tea. Like, even I can see that stuff, but they are painting this as just a beautiful and happy slave. And this is kind of the start of the mass media propaganda that started showing up in advertising too, because all of these artists with their happy slaves, they start using those images in advertising. So you see, this is the grossest one for me. You see soap companies saying, don't be dirty like this Black person, be clean like this white person.
Ooh, gross. So gross.
It's so gross. This is
No.
all from the Daughters of the Confederacy. These women are diabolical.
And this group's around today.
Diabolical.
This group is around today.
Yes. Yes.
It
I don't
has
know how many
money.
members they have. I don't know how many
They are
members
still
they
doing
have.
stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I had somebody, when I did my TikTok live yesterday, she got on there and she goes, "Oh, my mom was in the Daughters of the Confederacy."
Wow.
And I was like, holy crap.
Okay,
So,
so I'm a parent of 3 children.
mhm.
I want my kids taught the accurate stuff at an age-appropriate level. One of the most important things to me, and I bet a lot of you listening would have this too, is to teach your kids empathy. Is to make sure that your children care about the other kids in class, the teacher, the people in our neighborhood, our community, so that we all help each other.
Yeah.
I do not want my children to read in textbooks inaccurate depictions of slavery. They don't need to know the true horrors at 6 years old, but
No.
my almost 15-year-old could get a more in-depth picture. And when he goes to college, I want him to get what happened.
Yep.
So I'm just upset as a parent. I will do my best to teach my children this, but I want it taught in schools in age appropriate manner, you know? Yeah. So this is upsetting to me.
It is upsetting. And because it is, especially in a place like Indiana, where there's such an attack on education, where there's such a demonization of public school teachers, and they're indoctrinating our kids. That to me, there's such a disconnect there, because how are they indoctrinating? You're telling them what's going in the textbook based on what you're comfortable with, not what the history is. And because
they're just so scared of the truth.
There's so
many
scared of
people
it.
are so scared of the truth. And it's not calling you personally a horrible person. We're saying this awful history happened. Let's learn, grow, and not repeat it.
Yep.
I think they're just taking it too personally.
It's again, like, and we talked about this last week, right? Yeah. It ain't about you, Susan. It ain't about you, Susan. Like, it's not about you. It's not. And this was so, the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama. So Montgomery's the capital in Alabama. There is still a Confederate statue that stands in Montgomery, Alabama, in the capital, the state capital, the symbol of your state. And it wasn't until 2015 that the Confederate flags on flagpoles that surrounded the statue were taken down.
10 years ago.
10 years ago. And the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, he was leading the charge to get this. He wanted the statue taken down too. He's like, look, I am Southern. All of my family is from here. We have to reckon with what we did before. It is disgusting. It's not about me. I mean, he was really working. He's a white guy. He was working his butt off as a white Southern man to say, this is not about you and me. It's not about you and me. This is about respecting the people who come to the Montgomery State Capitol today. This is about respecting the people of Indiana.
Yeah, imagine how it makes like a Black person feel when they go to the Capitol.
Imagine. It's horrific.
And that's their capital, and
that's their capital.
It's sure letting them know they care about them.
And you can see, if you watch any of those protests, if anybody remembers the Charlottesville protests in 2015, where some people lost their lives, these protests around monuments, people are using Daughters of the Confederacy talking points from the 1890s. That is the thread that is pulled for over 130 years.
The damage this one group has done is immense.
One group of diabolical Southern white women. They horrific. And what they were able to do, the consequences, the people who argue with me in my comments on social media today have bought into that propaganda. And that is how influential this group was. And
it's hard to admit that you were misled. It's humbling. I've been misled before. I thought many of things that weren't true because people spent time convincing me of those things. And it's humbling and hard. But if we can get to that place, I would assume everybody listening's learned something new. I've learned a ton of things from you. It helps me readjust the history that I have in my head to get it more accurate. If we can all just take a minute and realize it's not about us. It's okay that we were taught things wrong. It's okay. It's not calling us a bad person or even that we've made a mistake. This is not our fault we were taught things that were
Yep.
wrong. But changing the viewpoint now, that's the point of this show. Learn it now, teach it to others, teach it to our children. Share this episode with anybody that you think might learn something and enjoy it. This is how we stop repeating history.
And get comfortable with ignorance. I say this all
That's
the time.
important.
Like,
Yeah, it's a good way to say that, Corinne.
I'm ignorant about so many
Me
things.
too. There's so many things I don't know.
I can't, and we can't, right? There is no
My brain
realistic
can't handle all the
possibility
information.
that we could know everything in the world. There are, what, 8 billion people in the whole world? Each of us we're kind of experts in maybe 4 things. Let's be like 4 things. I remember, this is kind of a sidetrack, but this is what we do because it's funny. And I'm getting to the end of our part here. So just hang on a little bit longer, people. But there was a stand-up comedian that I listened to like years ago, and his wife has a PhD. And so he was talking about like getting into arguments with her. And she would be like, don't insult me. Like I have a doctorate. Like I'm not, he's like, you're an expert in one thing. You gotta be like, you're a PhD in one thing.
You can't be an expert in everything.
And he's like, I know a little bit of information about a lot of things. You know a lot of information about one thing. So don't pretend that so it's just, I think about that all the time. And if we are ignorant, it's fine. Once we are presented
if we're
with
willing to say, I don't know.
I don't know.
I
Once
have to do that
presented,
with Tim Peck, a co-founder, he'll tell me something, I'll be like, nope, don't know it. And I'll say something to him and he'll go, don't know it.
Don't know it.
Just being vulnerable enough with each other to admit we don't know everything is a really important step in not repeating these mistakes.
Yeah.
It seems so simple, but it really helps. You're so right.
And as if a white person is hearing this information or this piece of history for the first time, and you maybe are hearing voices of your ancestors, you're hearing voices of your parents or your grandparents that are saying like racism is a thing of the past. Maybe just stop for a second and just say, is this information I don't know? If it's something I don't know, I'm just going to know it now. And there doesn't have to be an emotion attached to it.
And you don't need to get mad at any family members that told you incorrect things. They were lied to.
They were lied to.
Their fault.
We were just talking to how they were lied to.
Right.
So
it was a very calculated years and years. Yes.
Now, again, it's still their responsibility to do better. Our grandparents
we don't need to get mad at them, and we don't need to think we should be angry at them. It's just a level of acceptance.
Accept it. Accept that you don't know.
We can learn and grow now. Yes. What things are you going to teach me next week, Corinne? I can't wait.
I can't wait, right? Like who knows? And what things am I going to learn through this conversation? Because one of the pushbacks that comes up so often is, stop trying to make white people feel guilty.
Yeah,
that's on you.
Guilty. Like I don't have guilt on this. I have sadness as a human being for other humans being hurt. I don't feel guilty. I didn't do it. We don't need to all be grouped into a white thing and a black thing. We're all human beings. Humans hurting humans. No guilt or shame. Just learn and grow.
Learn
and grow.
And appreciate. And if you remove, because when somebody says the guilt,
they feel attacked. Like they're feeling personally attacked.
They feel personally. So again, so they're making it. So Susan, it's not about you, honey. You got to stop. It's not about you. Like, take it out of you personally. But I also think that guilt is kind of telling, because I think people who do now understand systemic racism, and we kind of understand, like, look, my parents, my grandparents, as a white woman, I have privileges. I have benefited from, DEI. I have benefited from generational wealth. I have benefited from this. I understand that was a system that honestly was created for white people. It was created for me. It was created for my family. I just understand that. And I appreciate that. And it's me acknowledging my privilege. There's not guilt attached to that. And I think when someone says, why are you trying to make me feel guilty? I just think they haven't done that work yet. Because I think deep down, they understand there are certain privileges they have been afforded. And they haven't undone that work. And so it's a defense mechanism to say, stop trying to
Yes.
make me feel guilty.
And I agree with you. And everybody just give yourself grace. I am not
Yeah,
perfect. I mess up every single day.
all the time.
And I have to give myself grace and just try to do better. And I encourage that of everybody. I think we're too hard on ourselves. And because we're so hard on ourselves, we get the guilt and then we get the shield of, why do I need to learn about this? Stop trying to make me feel guilty. And
Hmm.
if we just acknowledge it a little bit and give ourselves grace, we can all work on this together.
We sure
We can have
can.
this conversation. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
All right,
what's the
so
last thing? Let's finish
yeah,
up
we'll get
here.
to our last part here.
I can't
So
believe my 6-year-old twins are being so good, by the way.
they're being amazing, and
They're
I
home from
hope
school today.
I hope they feel better very soon.
Thanks. I just can't. I can't believe it.
They're doing great. So because of all of this mass propaganda, so no, we're seeing these happy slave depictions now
Right.
in advertising all over the country. Black Americans, and especially prominent Black thought leaders, are like, okay, y'all, we've got to organize. This is obviously a movement that is getting out of control. We have to take back the narrative here. We have to
Yes.
try to organize to start to
Yes.
gain back some of our freedoms. And there were, following the passing of Frederick Douglass, he died in 1895 or 96.
I believe he married a white woman too.
Did he really? I did not know that. So look,
Mhm.
I didn't know something, and I'm not
Yeah.
upset about it.
I just think
learned it.
that's really cool that they did that back then.
Long before it was
Way to
legal
go.
in most
Way
places,
to
right?
go. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there were really kind of two schools of thought, because it is also important to remember that especially in politics, we hear like the Black vote, we hear the Black electorate, we hear things that make Black America sound as if it's a monolith, and that's just not
they're
fair.
just people with
They're just people, and there's differences within all people. So to make it kind of a monolith is kind of unfair. But there were really two schools of thought at the time. You had Booker T. Washington, who very much was coming from a place of placating white people in some ways. He was kind of sneaky with what he did. I do kind of like some of his writing. But he was coming from a place of, Black people, you got to make yourself useful. Make yourself useful through labor, and then we will get economic power, and then we will start to gain our political power. So kind of do it nicely, right?
Right.
That was kind of one school of thought. The other school of thought was from W.E.B. Du Bois. And he was kind of like, yeah, screw that. We're going to take what's ours because we know our rights. And what we're going to do is we're going to agitate and protest for our rights. But the first step to doing that is actually educating Black people about what their rights are, because most Black people are kind of just accepting, well, this is just gone for me.
They're probably scared and they don't want to,
exactly. And Du Bois is saying, no, we are not just going to work for another 50 years and make white people rich. We are going to fight for what we need, what we need to take. And so Du Bois partnered up with a guy, his last name was Trotter. He was a newspaper publisher, a Black man. And in 1905, they had a landmark meeting in Fort Erie in Ontario, and they called it the Niagara Movement. And it was dozens of very prominent Black thought leaders that got together and kind of for the first time started systematically making a plan of how are we going to do this? How are we going to take back our rights? How are we going to protect our people? The members of the Niagara Movement would start to form coalitions and relationships with other sympathetic white Americans, because there were plenty of white Americans who hated what was happening, who hated that Reconstruction had been undone, and those were kind of their allies. And so this group of people got together, and they eventually, in 1909, so just 4 years later, they became the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP.
Oh, wow.
And so that 1909 founding of the NAACP and the first publicly on a national scale movement to attempt to reassert Black Americans back into their position as free begins in 1909. And that's where we will pick up next week.
That's amazing. Shout out to the Quakers, because that was a group of white people that were against slavery.
They were.
They fought for it the whole time. And
they were always against slavery.
They always did a lot of brave things.
Yep.
So it's not all white people bad. It's just
Nope.
white people
There
in
were
power. Those
plenty
people in
of
power
white.
wanted to stay in power. It's not that everybody was bad. Yeah.
Nope.
And
Yeah,
yeah.
and we have to, we remember, Thaddeus Stevens, the white congressman from last episode, who right after the Civil War, when he learned that President Johnson pardoned all of those white Confederate soldiers, and Thaddeus Stevens was like, hell no, and he didn't let them sit in Congress. So there were plenty of Americans who were hopeful for the promise. It just, nobody ever gave it enough time. And so this kind of dismantling, and so to think of, like, we had 14 years or so of Reconstruction. Oh, thank you, Liz.
That's my mother-in-law, Corinne. She
Thank
said
you,
Corinne would be
Liz.
an excellent college history teacher. I agree, but
I
I'm really
have
glad she's not doing that and she's talking to me instead. So.
Can I just be like, can I be this level of a teacher where I just talk into a microphone, and just like tell stories to my friends, because this is a fun part for me. But so, and it is like, so Reconstruction was 14 years. We've gone about 25, 30 years now post Reconstruction. And so I always think of, like, what really would have happened if they just would have stuck with it. If they just would have stuck with it. The founding of the NAACP, and maybe that would have been founded anyway. I would assume that it would have been needed anyway. The founding of the NAACP. But when that organization was founded in 1909, can you imagine if Reconstruction had just kept going? Like, what could they have accomplished in 1909 that was completely abandoned? So there kind of are a lot of just like, man, I wish they would have gotten it together. I wish they would have figured it out, because there were so many lost opportunities, and so many pieces of this story that are through lines to our politics today, that when you don't heal the wound, it festers. When you slap a Band-Aid on it and say, we got a black president, so we did it, y'all, racism is dead. It festers, and this wound, it's infected, y'all, and it's never healed. And these are the kind of conversations that we have to keep having. So, and I'm glad you mentioned your kids too, Sarah, because our kids need to know this. And yeah, there are so many age appropriate videos on YouTube. PBS.
I really like Who Was books. I like Who Was books a lot. I've read tons of them. When I taught 5th grade, I did a whole unit on Who Was books, but it's written in age appropriate for kids that can read those books. And they're like 100 pages with pictures. And I read the Douglas one, Frederick Douglass, and that's why I knew about the white wife.
My kids love those books too. The Who Was. Yeah.
So we're gonna pick up with part 3 of this next week.
Yep.
We'll release that time once we get it figured out. And I'm gonna have get the word out on Sunday at noon with Scott Aaron Rogers about manipulation, how we can prevent ourselves from being manipulated, and how we can help save our friends and family that think things that are not true and are maybe influencing their lives in negative ways. We're going to give you real tips, real things you can do to help those issues, which is very important right now.
Yeah,
I definitely think. And then we are a up and coming new independent media company, and we would love your support. If you would like to support what we're doing, all these shows are free, and they're always going to be free. If you would like to support us and get a gift, please visit right here at please visit heylmer.com/project next, and you can make a donation, or you support us, and then you get a gift from the store. So for like if you make $100 donation, you can get a Project Next shirt in 3 different colors. There's hoodies, there's stickers, there's all kinds of cool Project Next items that you can get if you support us. So that would help a lot. I did get a bunch of new equipment that my husband is helping me put together to do on location shows. So those are coming soon.
That's so exciting.
Our current stomach bug delayed us a week, but we're working on that. And I'm pretty excited about everything that we're doing. I'm really blessed to work with Corinne. I'm so glad she's a friend of mine. How'd I get so lucky? I don't know. And thanks, everybody. Please share. Just put share on whatever you're watching this. And if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to our YouTube. It's one word, Project Next Movement, all one word. Please subscribe, and then you can share our shows that way. And then whatever social media platform you're on, you can share our things. That helps us so much. And text a friend. Is there anybody that you can think of that would benefit from our shows? It
Mhm.
would help that would help their lives in anything. They would enjoy the content. Maybe they're stressing out about their news source. Maybe they could turn that off and they could watch one of these shows and we could connect that way. And maybe it'll help their mental health some because
Yeah,
things are a little dark right now.
they
So
are. But these kind of stories and this kind of community, I'm very excited for everything that Project Next is putting together, and
we have more big things coming.
we
We have a
do.
website coming. I just shout out to Scott Aaron Rogers.
He's
He is doing
amazing.
a lot of behind the scenes things for us. He is working on our website, and we're getting graphics for each of the shows. And then my husband makes the music for us, and we're just gonna keep pumping. And I'm excited for our future. What about you, girl?
I am too, and I can't wait to come back next week and do our third part of this.
If all three of my children are at school when we record, I am going to be so happy. I
Oh, that's
mean,
going to be awesome.
because last week was one. I think it helped having two because they played with each other
Yes,
this time. Because
they
last week
entertain
I had to
themselves.
keep going. Adeline wanted TV changes.
This is awesome. No, they're entertaining themselves
And not fighting, because sometimes
not,
it goes the other way.
I couldn't hear any of them. I couldn't hear them this whole time.
That's great. I can hear them. I'm glad you can.
I think every once in a while, but I was like, oh, they're just talking or something.
My
They're
little
fine.
cuties. So I'm going to get my little cuties' attention now. And you guys, thank you so much for listening and watching, and love all of you, and just have a great week. Hopefully I'll see you Sunday, but if you can't watch the live, you can watch it after it's live. So it's out on everywhere.
I can't wait.
I forgot to play the music.
The music.
To get us out.
We need the music.
There we go. So yeah, thanks everybody. Share. And oh, and you can also tell us your thoughts. What did you think about the episode? Was there something we left out? Was there a thought you thought of that might help us? Put it in the comments. We'll read it and comment back. So yeah. All right.
I love it. Thank you, Sarah. This was fun. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening, everybody.
You're amazing. Thank you, girl.
You are